Steve Saretsky here. As always, this is Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you're getting sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments below. I did an interview this past week with BNN and Bloomberg just discussing the latest data from CMHC, basically highlighting the number of foreign buyers. I don't want to get drag this on too much because quite honestly I'm pretty tired and sick of the whole foreign buyer discussion. Not that I don't think it's an influence, but it's just we're never going to be able to quantify the number of foreign buyers, the number of foreign capital. You just can't really quantify a foreign capital number. I think what people are ultimately upset about is it's ultimately an immigration problem, because a lot of the foreign capital is maybe recently immigrated Chinese that actually have Canadian citizenship. So that's really an endless debate, political debate that I don't really want to dive into too much. But I think the one thing that interests me is just to see, we obviously know there's a high concentration of foreign capital in pre-sale condos, and that was certainly the case in the data, which again is not perfect by any stretch, but it's the best data that we have. It shows that just under 20% of condos that were completed between the periods of 2016 and 2017 are owned by basically non-residents. So that really just goes to illustrate that again, as we know, is the pre-sale market, particularly the last number of years, has been heavily concentrated and heavily dependent on foreign capital flows, particularly out of China. So you can imagine how that would impact that segment of the market as Chinese capital flows get stymied and further taxation policies come into play. And that's why we've seen the pre-sale absorption rate really fall off in the pre-sale market. And I think there's more headwinds, particularly for that space, coming here in the short term. So, and that also brings me into a part of the reason why I do these videos, is there was actually an article that was circulating around the internet, and I had probably 10 people reach out to me and either call me or send me an email basically asking if there was any sort of truth to this report. And so basically it was just an article in a local Vancouver newspaper stating that foreign buyers were propelling the recovery in the West Vancouver housing market. And of course, if you don't know the West Vancouver housing market, sales have absolutely plummeted off a cliff. Prices have fallen 40% from their peak valuations. Again, these are houses that are priced between $3, $4, $5 million. So really, it shouldn't be a surprise that when you stymie Chinese capital flows and increase the tax base towards that set of buyers, that that market is just fallen off a cliff. So it was just funny. It was basically, long story short, is that article was essentially summarizing that this recovery had started, that foreign buyers were back, they were buying. Open houses were flooded with Chinese guys, and it really was just ultimately just a propaganda piece. It was actually mostly quoting the CEO of Juai, which is a Chinese real estate agency marketing company that basically drives the revenue through Vancouver realtors promoting listings on their website. So if we actually look at the data, again, we try to keep things data dependent here until these change, the story is irrelevant. If we look at sales from January 1st to March 15th and compare that over the last 4 or 5 years, during that time period there would have been about 300 detached home sales for 2015 and 2016 in that West Vancouver period. So I'm saying, just to clarify, in 2015 there was 300 sales for West Vancouver homes. In 2016 there was just slightly over 300 homes. And then now what we've seen in 2018 and 2019, they're tied. To date we have 51 home sales from the time period of January 1st to March 15th. So you can see that the volumes, have just been absolutely decimated, and there's no recovery yet in the sales volumes. I suspect the sales volumes have likely bottomed and will begin to rise from here. But that likely is ultimately going to result in lower prices, and that's similar to what we saw in the U.S. The data is all out there, but if you want to pull up You could even pull back and look at Florida condos. So what you see is basically the volumes ultimately peter out, the volumes peak, and then there's sort of a lag period between the prices dropping. And then ultimately as the sales start to increase, your prices actually accelerated down at a much rapid pace, because you sort of get like this clearance rate where the sellers basically adjust their expectations. The lower prices entice more buyers back in. So you get basically an increase in sales volume, but a decrease in home prices. And so that's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see, you know, if that shapes up here in Vancouver, if this truly, if this trend were to continue and a housing bust were to unwind. If you look and go back and study previous housing busts, this has typically always been the case, where volumes will ultimately bottom, but it's not like a stock market where you're going to get like a V-shaped recovery. Housing is very cyclical. It's very nuanced. There's a lot of human emotions and human behavior in the market. And as I continue to say, in this market, like, it's so all over the place right now. There's almost, you know, there's very few transactions taking place. You know, there's very little liquidity. You have some sellers that are capitulating, such as you go into West Vancouver, I think parts of Richmond, there's huge drops there. And then you have some sellers that are just completely holding firm and refusing to sort of lower their price, not entertaining lowball offers. And that, you know, they'll probably just sit in the market for, who knows, 3, 4, 5 more, 6 more months. I don't really know. But and then you have the odd one that's still getting the odd multiple offer. So it's that and everywhere in between. But as I always like to say, you know, like the whole point of these videos is basically just to do a macro overview and put together a thesis. I'm sort of waiting for the moment to become just this raging housing bull. But I think that, you know, and maybe it's getting close in West Van, down 40%. But I still see a lot of headwinds in place. You know, particularly is the Canadian household indebtedness situation. This has been my main premise, has been my main focus. That is the framework. If you study the great financial guys, investors of our time, George Soros, Ray Dalio, they put a huge emphasis on debt, and in particular in the household sector. That is what matters, because households have to be able to service the debt, and what Canadians have been doing to service their debt is they've been basically just rolling over existing debt, basically continuously refinancing that, and that's basically been on the backs of rising home values. But now you don't need necessarily a decline in home values, you only need home values to go flat for refinancing issues to surface, and then stresses mount in the Canadian consumer. So, you know, one thing I always talk about is the differences between and the things that shaped up in the U.S. housing market and the Canadian housing market, and the Canadian economy for that matter, is there was no deleveraging phase in the Canadian economy in 2008. So what happened was, in the U.S. in 08, 09, households deleveraged. What does that mean? It basically means they paid down their debts, they didn't borrow money, and so this is basically, it's the deflationary environment where you're basically using all your money to service your debt. So what you can see is, like, in the U.S. today, the household debt servicing ratio is at record lows. It's actually had a historical low, the debt service ratio in the U.S. I think it's at just over 9%. Now, if you switch to Canada, the government was able to sort of stave off the financial crisis mostly through increasing the number of bank loans being issued in 2008, 2009. So they basically brought in a number of policies to continue to allow banks to lend and provide liquidity. And this basically, they basically encouraged the Canadian households to continue to borrow more money, and so Canadian households never had a deleveraging period. In fact, we actually just accumulated more and more debt. So if you actually, over the last 5 years, the private sector in Canada has grown has had the quickest pace of private credit growth of any other country in the past 5 years. So what you see today is the Canadian debt service ratio as of the end of Q4. These numbers just came out. The debt service ratio actually just hit an all-time high. And so you can see how that's a problem, because basically consumers are so indebted and the debt service ratio is so extreme. It's the highest it's ever been, and yet rates have actually never really been lower. I mean, yes, the Bank of Canada's hiked rates a few times, but the overnight interest rate from the Bank of Canada still sits at 1.75%, which in real terms is actually still a negative interest rate. And despite that, the debt servicing ratio just hit an all-time high. So there's really not much room where this is something that is considered basically pushing on a string. Even if you hammered interest rates down to zero, the Canadian household is still going to be basically bogged down through high indebtedness and high debt payments, where that really just hinders future growth on the Canadian economy. So sometimes, people say, well, you're like a housing bull, or you want this, or you want that, or you're so pessimistic. I actually think that a household deleveraging situation, if managed correctly, is honestly better for the Canadian economy in the long run. It's not positive for home prices, but if we're talking about overall well-being of Canadians, it would actually be prudent to have a sort of beautiful deleveraging, quote unquote. So I think that's something to watch for, and obviously basically what has driven the Canadian economy over the last 10, 15 years, and this is not a shock. I mean, you go read any bank economist report and they're, they'll paint it out to you clear as day. It shouldn't be any sort of confusion, is the Canadian consumer, through rising home values, has driven most of the growth in the Canadian economy. But because of that, they're now at these very indebted levels, and you can't rely on the Canadian consumer to drive growth in the years ahead. So what we're likely to see is we're likely to continue to see consumer growth slow. You continue to see debt payments impact consumer spending. So we can see these issues begin to mount, particularly when you restrict mortgage credit growth. That's what we're seeing through the mortgage stress test. That's why you're seeing a huge dampening in home values, in home sales. There's basically, you haven't seen it so much maybe in home values, at least on a national scale, but what we're seeing is the liquidity has now dried up, and generally the volumes peak, and there's a sort of a gap period as people adjust to the market, and then that ultimately results in lower prices. So you're starting to now see that on a national level. February data just came out across Canada. The number of home sales in February across the nation, it was the fewest home sales. It was the worst February that the Canadian housing market has had since 2009. So again, worst February in a decade. It was actually the first time in a decade as well that the home price index, which is a lagging indicator, it's really a smoothed out index. As you'll see, it never actually really goes negative. It just actually went negative for the first time on a year-over-year basis. So again, these are all factors that I'm sort of watching on and keeping track of. What I am primarily focused is honestly not as much even on the housing market. It's more so on the household sector and what is going to happen. I think that what you're seeing is basically, and as Ray Dalio would call it, a long-term debt cycle, i.e. a Canadian consumer after 30 years of borrowing, particularly on the backs of as I've said, falling yields and rising home prices, has allowed to borrow, but now rates really can't go much lower. They can drop them a little bit, but it's not really going to give you much extra stimulation. It's similar to Europe and Japan. You can hammer rates to zero, but you can't make people borrow money. And so it's like you've had negative interest rates in Europe for the last decade. You've had negative rates in Japan for the last 2 decades, and yet growth has been almost non-existent. Inflation has been almost non-existent, other than going into asset prices. Not in Japan, but in parts of Europe, actually more so Germany, because they actually didn't have a household debt bubble that popped in 08, 09, like the other countries did in Europe. But again, you can like everything. So now what we're seeing in the Canadian housing market is you're seeing bond yields are plummeting because the market is perceiving, weaker growth ahead, weaker inflation, and that weaker, inflation is subdued. And so what you're seeing is basically like the bond yields are plunging, and interest rates, like 5-year fixed mortgage rates are actually coming down right now. They're coming down 10, 15 basis points. And that might provide like a little bit of a shot in the arm to maybe the spring market, or it might help offset things a little bit. But you're at these levels of debt and you're at these levels of home prices where it's just really not going to be stimulative at this point. And again, I'd love to be proven wrong. I mean, I'm sure we'll see how things shape up here. But like if the Bank of Canada cuts rates, that's my inkling that they'll cut rates before the next hike. It'll probably be, I think I said before, I've been saying this for the last 4 or 5 months, that the Bank of Canada was done at 1.75%. My guess is a cut, if I had to put money on it, probably comes in Q3, maybe Q4, probably somewhere in between there. And what are they going to do? They're going to cut from 175 to 150. That takes, Bank of Canada seems to think it takes 12 months to actually filter through the system. And so these rate cuts are ultimately going to be lagging behind any real stimulus that's provided. And again, even if you cut rates from 175 down to 1 and then even down to 0, I think we look at Europe and Japan as prime examples of there's only so much the interest rates can do to actually really stimulate demand, particularly when you have the level of indebtedness that you do. You have a lot of basically structural problems that lowering interest rates cannot fix. And hopefully people are becoming aware of this, certainly not policymakers. And 10 years into record low interest rates and $20 trillion of money printing through quantitative easing. And really, the recovery has been muted, to say the least. So, that's just the way they're going, is they have to avoid deflation by all costs. And so you just keep trying to basically devalue the currency through money printing and try to generate inflation that just they can't seem to generate. So other than in asset prices, but we shall see how things shape up. That's all I got for today. I know it was a bit of a rant, a bit of a ramble, but those are just some of the things I'm looking at. So anyways, hope that helps. See